The alarm bells rang through the Zephyrian Collective's main monitoring station like a death knell. Officer Velthor had been tracking routine space traffic when the emergency signal burst through their communications array. The transmission was weak, broken, and filled with static, but the terror in the alien voice was unmistakable. "This is Commander Yethkol of the Kethmori Defense Fleet." The voice crackled through the speakers. "We need immediate assistance. The Ancient Ones have awakened. They're eating everything. Our worlds are dying." Velthar's tentacles trembled as he cleaned up the signal. The Kethmori system was 300 light-years away, a peaceful collection of agricultural worlds known for their beautiful crystal, gardens, and harmless population. What could possibly threaten such a quiet corner of the galaxy? The answer came in the form of grainy video footage that made every technician in the room step back in horror. Massive mechanical creatures the size of city blocks were systematically stripping entire planets bare. They moved like a swarm of metallic insects, each one the size of a skyscraper. Their razor-sharp appendages tearing through forests, cities, and mountains with equal ease. But the most terrifying part wasn't their size or their weapons. It was how they reproduced. Every tree, every building, every living creature they touched was broken down at the molecular level and rebuilt into more of themselves. The organic matter didn't just die, it was converted, transformed into part of the mechanical plague that was spreading across the Kethmori. Worlds like a cancer. The Collective's greatest scientific minds worked around the clock to understand what they were facing. Dr. Zenter, their leading expert on ancient technologies, delivered his findings to the emergency council session with shaking hands. "These are the Devourers," he announced to the packed chamber. "We thought they were just legends, stories told to frighten children. But they're real, and they're exactly as dangerous as the old texts described." The ancient records spoke of mechanical beings that had once consumed entire civilizations before mysteriously vanishing into deep space. They were adaptive, intelligent, and utterly relentless. Every weapon fired at them was analyzed, understood, and rendered useless within minutes. Every strategy used against them was learned and countered. "How long do we have?" asked Council. Leader Mordain, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Zenter's calculations were grim. 6 cycles, maybe 7 if we're lucky. At their current rate of expansion, they'll reach our outer colonies within that time frame. And once they start spreading into populated galactic regions, there will be no stopping them. The chamber fell, silent. Every conventional military force that had engaged the Devourers had been completely absorbed. Their ships, their weapons, their very crews had all been converted into more mechanical plague. Traditional warfare was not just ineffective, it was actively feeding the enemy. The peaceful Zephyrian Collective, species that had known nothing but harmony for thousands of years, suddenly found themselves facing the complete annihilation of all organic life in their galaxy. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. The Zephyrian archives had never seen such frantic activity. Teams of researchers worked day and night, diving into databases that hadn't been touched in centuries. They were looking for anything, any species or technology that might stand a chance against the Devourers. Most of what they found was useless, peaceful trading partners, extinct civilizations, and long-dead empires that had fallen to far lesser threats. Archivist Kelmer was 3 days into her search when she stumbled across a file buried so deep in the restricted sections that it required special clearance just to read the title. The xenobiology classification was marked with warnings in 12 different languages, and the access log showed it hadn't been opened in over 2,000 years. The file was labeled simply, Species Classification, Extreme Caution, Deathworld. Origin. Her hand shook as she opened it. The first entry made her blood run cold. It described a planet called Earth, located in a remote spiral arm of the galaxy. But this wasn't just any planet. It was what the ancient xenobiologists called a death world, a place so hostile to life that it shouldn't have been able to produce any intelligent species at all. The planet's surface was covered in massive bodies of toxic liquid that the inhabitants somehow drank. The atmosphere contained a gas so reactive that it literally burned through organic tissue, yet the creatures breathed it like it was harmless. The world was bombarded by deadly radiation from its own star, experienced regular catastrophic weather events. It was populated by predators that would be classified as weapons of mass destruction on any civilized world. But somehow, impossibly, one species had not just survived, but thrived in this hellscape. They called themselves humans, and according to the files, they were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The records painted a picture of beings. They could survive in environments that would kill most galactic species in minutes. They could function with massive physical injuries that would incapacitate others. They could go without food or water for periods that seemed impossible. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to actually become stronger and more dangerous when faced with existential threats. They exhibit what can only be described as weaponized stubbornness, one report noted. When threatened with extinction, they do not flee or surrender. Instead, they adapt, innovate, and fight back with an intensity that borders on the supernatural. Another entry was even more ominous. First contact protocols strongly advise against any interaction with this species. They are unpredictable, prone to violence, and seem to view every challenge as an opportunity for conquest rather than a reason for caution. The files contained scattered reports from the few brave xenobiologists who had observed humans from a distance. They described creatures that hunted apex predators for sport, who built their settlements in the most dangerous locations on their planet as if daring nature itself to challenge them, and who had somehow developed technology that defied conventional physics. One report that particularly caught Kelmer's attention described human military tactics. They do not fight wars, it stated. They fight extinction events. Every battle is approached as if the survival of their entire species depends on the outcome. The warnings were consistent across every file. Contact with humans was considered so dangerous that it had been forbidden by galactic law. They were described as a species that had turned survival into an art form, who treated impossible odds as merely another problem to solve. As Kelmore read through the files, she realized that the galaxy's greatest fear might also be its only hope. The Devourers were an extinction-level threat, and humans were apparently extinction-level survivors. It was a terrifying gamble, but with entire worlds being consumed, they were running out of options. Ambassador Velthor's diplomatic ship approached the edge of human space with extreme caution. The crew had spent weeks preparing for what they expected would be a dangerous encounter. With primitive savages barely capable of space travel, the ancient files suggested humans had only recently developed faster-than-light technology, so they anticipated finding a few scattered outposts struggling to survive in the hostile void of space. What they found instead stopped them dead in their tracks. The first human colony they encountered was a massive orbital station that dwarfed anything in Zephyrian space. It wasn't just big, it was impossibly complex, with defensive systems that made their sensors scream warnings about weapon signatures they couldn't even classify. The station's design looked like someone had taken a fortress and launched it into space, complete with armor plating that seemed to absorb rather than reflect energy. How is this possible? Whispered Navigation Officer Temcor, staring at the readings. According to our files, they should barely have interplanetary travel. The situation became even more confusing when they were contacted by the human defense fleet. The ships that surrounded them moved with precision that spoke of advanced artificial intelligence, yet their hulls looked like they were built to ram through asteroid fields. Every vessel bristled with weapons that violated several known laws of physics, including energy cannons that seemed to draw power from miniature stars. Captain Kim's voice came through their communications array with a calm professionalism that was somehow more intimidating than any threat. Welcome to the Sol Defense Perimeter. State your business. Velthar had rehearsed this moment countless times, but actually speaking to a human was different than he'd imagined. There was something in the captain's tone that suggested she was simultaneously polite and ready to obliterate his ship without a second thought. "We come seeking assistance," Velthor began, then explained the Devourer crisis in detail. He described the mechanical plague consuming entire worlds, the failed military responses, and the desperate calculations showing they had maybe 6 cycles before galactic civilization fell. He expected negotiations, demands for payment, or at least questions about what humans would gain from helping. Instead, Captain Kim's response was immediate and decisive. "We'll help," she said simply. "When do you need us?" The simplicity of the response caught Velthor off guard. You'll help? Just like that? Don't you need to consult with your government? Discuss terms?" "The terms are simple," Kim replied. "You're facing extinction. We stop extinction. Oh, that's what we do." But then came the part that made Velthor's blood run cold. "However, we're not sending a small task force or a diplomatic envoy. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. We're bringing everything. Everything. Every ship in the Terran Defense Fleet. Every soldier. Every weapon. Every piece of technology we've developed. The entire human military is mobilizing as we speak." The implications hit Velthor like a physical blow. Humans weren't just offering to help, they were preparing for total war. This wasn't a rescue mission to them. It was an extinction event that required their complete military might. "How many ships are we talking about?" he managed to ask. Captain Kim's slight pause before answering made it clear she was checking numbers. "That we're still growing. Current count is just over 12,000 combat vessels, with support fleets bringing the total to around 30,000 ships. We'll have exact numbers when the outer colonies finish their mobilization." Velthor's ship fell silent. The entire Zephyrian collective had maybe 300 military vessels, and they considered that a substantial fleet. Humans had built an armada that could conquer half the galaxy, and they were casually deploying all of it to help complete strangers. "We'll be at your coordinates in 72 hours, Kim continued. "I suggest you warn your allies. We don't want any friendly fire incidents when we arrive." When the human fleet finally reached Zephyrian space, every alien who witnessed it fell completely silent. What they saw wasn't anything like what they expected from a civilized species. These weren't the smooth, elegant ships that most advanced races use for exploration or trade. Instead, the humans brought something that looked like floating fortresses designed purely for war. Each human vessel was covered in weapons from front to back. Massive cannons stuck out at odd angles, missile pods were mounted everywhere possible, and energy weapons that seemed to bend the laws of physics hummed with barely contained power. The ships themselves looked like they had been built by people who expected to fight impossible battles every single day. There was no wasted space for comfort or beauty. Everything served the purpose of destruction. The alien observers watched in growing amazement as human crews prepared for what any reasonable species would consider a suicide mission. But these humans moved with the casual efficiency of people doing routine work. They checked their weapons with the same calm attitude other species might use when organizing a peaceful trading expedition. Young soldiers who barely looked old enough to leave their home planets were loading ammunition and running system checks as if preparing for certain death was just another Tuesday. "Admiral," Park stepped forward to address the gathered representatives from dozens of different galactic civilizations. She spoke with the kind of steady professionalism that comes from years of facing impossible situations. Her voice carried no fear, no hesitation, just the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst the universe could offer and lived to tell about it. She began explaining something that shocked every alien present. Humanity hadn't just stumbled into this situation unprepared. They had been getting ready for exactly this kind of existential threat. Since the day they first left Earth and discovered what the galaxy was really like, the universe, she told them, was fundamentally hostile to life. It wasn't just indifferent, it was actively trying to kill everything that dared to exist. Most species, when they reached the stars, found relatively peaceful corners of space and built comfortable civilizations. They developed art, philosophy, and technology for improving life. Humans had taken a completely different path. They had looked at the dangers lurking in the dark between stars and decided to build their entire civilization around surviving. Every single human ship was designed with one primary purpose: to fight against impossible odds and somehow win. Their military doctrine didn't plan for fair fights or reasonable enemies. Instead, they prepared for situations where they would be outnumbered, outgunned, And facing enemies that wanted to wipe out all life in the galaxy, every human soldier, from the newest recruit to the most experienced veteran, had been trained to face threats that could destroy entire civilizations. They didn't just learn how to fight other people, they learned how to battle forces that could end all existence. This wasn't paranoia or excessive preparation. This was humanity's response to discovering that the universe was filled with things that wanted them dead. The aliens realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. These weren't just warriors or explorers. These were survivors who had turned survival into an art form. And they were about to find out just how effective that art could be when human scientists finally got their hands on actual devourer samples. What they discovered sent chills through everyone who heard the report. These weren't just advanced machines, they were something far more terrifying. The devourers could adapt to any conventional weapon almost instantly, fire a laser at them, and within minutes they would develop energy shields, launch missiles, and they would quickly create countermeasures that made those weapons useless. The research teams watched in horror. As captured devourer fragments actually evolved in real time, they would take damage from a weapon once, maybe twice, and then suddenly that same weapon would become completely ineffective. It was like fighting an enemy that learned from every single attack and became immune to it forever. Most civilizations would have seen this and immediately given up hope. But humans had always been different. While other species relied on building bigger guns or stronger shields, humanity had developed something that the devourers apparently couldn't predict or adapt to as easily: complete unpredictability in warfare. They had learned to fight dirty, to think outside every possible box, and to use strategies that made absolutely no sense to anyone else. Dr. Lee stood before the assembled Galactic Coalition and began presenting battle plans that made every alien representative question whether humans were actually insane. Her first proposal was to weaponize entire stars. Not just harness their energy, but actually turn the stars themselves into weapons that could be directed at enemy positions. She explained this as casually as someone might discuss changing the batteries in a flashlight. The second plan involved converting entire moons into massive kinetic projectiles. The humans wanted to calculate precise trajectories and literally throw moons at the devourer forces. They had already run the mathematics and determined which moons in nearby systems would cause the most damage when accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. But perhaps the most disturbing proposal was their plan to deploy hybrid biological-mechanical weapons systems. These weren't just robots with organic components, they were living weapons that could think, adapt, and make decisions in ways that pure machines couldn't predict. The humans had apparently been developing these systems for years, preparing for exactly this kind of adaptive enemy. The alien representatives sat in stunned silence as Dr. Lee calmly explained that conventional thinking had never been humanity's strength anyway. While other species developed logical, predictable military strategies, humans had always embraced chaos and unpredictability as tactical advantages. They had learned that sometimes the best way to win was to do something so completely insane that even your own allies couldn't understand it. When pressed about the extreme nature of these proposals, the human scientists simply shrugged and said that desperate times called for desperate measures. They had faced extinction before and survived by refusing to play by anyone else's rules. The devourers might be able to adapt to conventional weapons, but they had never faced an enemy that was willing to throw physics itself out the window. The humans weren't just planning to fight the devourers, they were planning to fight them using methods that defied all rational military thinking. Because rational thinking was exactly what the enemy would expect. When the humans finally revealed their complete battle strategy, the reaction from every other species in the coalition was immediate and horrifying. What they heard wasn't just a military plan, it was something that challenged every basic principle of civilized warfare. The humans were proposing to deliberately sacrifice 3 entire human colony worlds, complete with all their populations, infrastructure, and centuries of development, simply to use them as bait. These weren't empty planets or abandoned outposts. These were thriving human settlements with millions of people who had built lives, raised families, and created entire communities. The humans wanted to evacuate what they could, but they knew that many civilians would never make it out in time. They were talking about accepting massive casualties among their own people as part of their opening move. The alien representatives couldn't comprehend this level of calculated sacrifice. Most species would fight to the last breath to protect every single world they possessed. The idea of deliberately offering up entire planets to an enemy was beyond their understanding of acceptable military strategy. As tactics, but the humans explained their reasoning with the same calm professionalism they brought to everything else. These 3 colony worlds would be positioned perfectly to draw the Devourer forces into a specific region of space. The mechanical plague would see defenseless human populations and move to consume them. Just like it had consumed countless other worlds, this predictable behavior was exactly what the humans were counting on. Once the Devourers committed their forces to attacking these sacrificial worlds, the humans would spring the most audacious trap in galactic history. They planned to collapse an entire star system, not just destroy it, but actually cause its gravitational structure to fold in on itself. This would create a massive gravitational anomaly, essentially a controlled black hole that would theoretically contain the mechanical plague forever. The process would involve detonating the system's primary star in a precisely calculated manner, while simultaneously destabilizing several nearby celestial bodies. The resulting gravitational chaos would create a space-time distortion so severe that nothing, not even the adaptive Devourers, could escape from it. It was like building a prison made of gravity itself. The Zephyrians and their allies pleaded desperately with the humans to reconsider such a drastic plan. They offered alternative strategies, proposed different approaches, and begged them to find some way that didn't involve such massive sacrifice. Surely there had to be another option that didn't require destroying entire star systems and accepting the deaths of millions. Commander Choi listened to all their objections with patient understanding, but her response was delivered with the quiet determination of someone who had seen too much to be swayed by sentiment. She explained that humanity had learned some harsh lessons about fighting extinction-level threats. Half measures didn't work. Compromise strategies didn't work. Playing it safe when facing total annihilation was just another way of guaranteeing total failure. Sometimes survival required making choices that were unthinkable to civilized minds. The humans had already made their choice, and they were prepared to pay whatever price was necessary to ensure that something would survive. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The massive space battle was about to begin, and for the first time ever, the alien coalition would see exactly how humans fought, and everything was on the line. What they witnessed that day would haunt their dreams and inspire their legends for generations to come. Human ships didn't just fire weapons and retreat like other species. They did something that made even the bravest alien warriors question their own courage. Human vessels deliberately crashed straight into enemy formations, turning their own ships into guided missiles of destruction. The alien observers couldn't believe their eyes. They watched human soldiers board Devourer ships, knowing full well they would never make it back home. These weren't suicide missions born of desperation. This was calculated warfare where humans weighed their own lives against strategic advantage and chose victory over survival every single time. Human commanders made decisions that left the coalition speechless. They sacrificed entire fleets, throwing thousands of ships into hopeless battles just to buy a few precious minutes of tactical advantage. While other species retreated when losses reached 10%, humans kept fighting when 90% of their forces were gone. The Devourers. Those terrifying machines that had swept across the galaxy, consuming entire civilizations, suddenly found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. Every species they had fought wanted to survive. Every army they had faced eventually broke when casualties mounted too high. But humans treated their own extinction as an acceptable price tag for victory. For the first time in countless ages, the unstoppable Devourers began to retreat. These mechanical monsters that had turned entire star systems into scrap metal were actually pulling back from human forces. The machines that had never known fear were learning what it meant to face an enemy that simply refused to lose. Captain. Song became the symbol of human warfare that day. Her massive dreadnought had taken severe damage, its weapons offline and hull breached in dozens of places. Any reasonable commander would have ordered an evacuation. Instead, Song turned her dying ship into a weapon itself. Her final transmission echoed across every communication channel in the battle zone. Her voice was calm, almost casual, as she spoke words that would be remembered forever. This is what happens when you threaten our galaxy. The massive human dreadnought slammed into the Devourer core ship at full speed. The explosion lit up space like a newborn star, taking out the enemy command vessel and dozens of smaller ships in the blast. All Song's sacrifice opened a gap in the Devourer lines that human forces immediately exploited. The alien coalition watched in stunned silence as the tide of battle shifted. Species that had cowered before the Devourers for millennia were seeing these unstoppable machines actually running away. The humans had done something that seemed impossible. They had made the Devourers afraid. This wasn't just about superior technology or clever tactics. This was about a species that fought like the galaxy itself depended on their victory, because to them, it did. The impossible had happened. Against all odds, the humans had actually won. The Devourers, those terrifying machines that had consumed countless civilizations, were finally defeated. But victory came with a price that made even the humans themselves pause in somber reflection. The numbers were staggering. Entire human fleets had been wiped from existence, their ships reduced to floating debris in the cold vacuum of space. 3 entire colony worlds, home to millions of human families, had been lost forever. The Devourers had turned these planets into lifeless husks before the human. Counterattack could save them. Thousands upon thousands of human lives had been sacrificed without a moment's hesitation. Pilots who flew their fighters into certain death, soldiers who held impossible positions until they were overrun, engineers who stayed behind to manually detonate reactors while their ships were being boarded. Each death was a calculated choice. A life traded for strategic advantage. The alien coalition members who had survived the battle floated in their ships. They had seen the Devourers contained, then systematically eliminated. The threat that had terrorized the galaxy for ages was finally gone. But the method of victory left them deeply unsettled. Admiral Park stood on the bridge of one of the few remaining human command ships, surveying the aftermath with the kind of calm that only comes from having prepared for exactly this moment. Her uniform was torn, her face marked with exhaustion, but her eyes held the steady resolve that had carried humanity through its darkest hour. The alien observers gathered around her, their questions written clearly in their expressions.
Ow.
Could humans make such sacrifices so easily? How could they throw away entire fleets without flinching? How could they watch their own worlds burn and still press forward? Park's explanation was simple and devastating in its honesty. Humanity had always known this day would arrive. From the moment they first looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there, they had understood that the galaxy was a dangerous place. They had built their entire civilization around a single, terrifying truth. Someday, someone would need to make the ultimate sacrifice to preserve life in the galaxy. And humans had decided long ago that if that day came, they would be ready to pay that price. Every human military academy taught the same lesson. Every colony ship that left Earth carried the same understanding. Every generation of humans grew up knowing that their species might one day need to stand between the galaxy and extinction. It's not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. The other species had always fought to survive. Humans had trained themselves to fight to win, regardless of whether they survived the victory. This wasn't recklessness or some death wish. It was the cold calculation of a species that had accepted responsibility for something bigger than themselves. The galaxy was safe now, but the cost had been paid in human blood and human worlds. And somehow, that seemed exactly right to every human who had survived. The silence that followed the victory was almost as profound as the battle itself. Across the galaxy, billions of beings tried to wrap their minds around what they had just witnessed. The humans had done the impossible, but the way they had done it changed everything about how the galaxy understood warfare, sacrifice, and survival. The Zephyrians, those graceful beings who had first welcomed humanity into galactic society, approached the human survivors with trembling hands. Their entire civilization felt overwhelmed with gratitude and debt. They had watched their new allies sacrifice entire fleets and whole worlds to save species they had only recently met. Other alien races joined the best Zephyrians in offering humanity whatever they wanted. Rare minerals that could power entire star systems, technology that could extend human life for centuries, territory that could house billions of human colonists, ancient knowledge that could unlock the secrets of the universe itself. The human response caught everyone completely off guard. They didn't want payment. They didn't demand territory or resources or technology. Instead, they asked for something that many species had never thought to offer each other: genuine friendship. Humanity wanted to share knowledge freely between all species. They wanted to learn from alien cultures and teach what they had discovered. They wanted to build a future where different civilizations could grow together instead of merely coexisting in the same galaxy. Colonel Hans stood before the Galactic Assembly, representing humanity in the most important diplomatic moment in galactic history. The assembled delegates from hundreds of species watched as this human, whose people had just saved them all, explained something that would reshape how the galaxy understood itself. Hans' words were simple but profound. Humanity had developed their terrible capabilities not because they loved war, but because they understood peace. They had learned to fight with such devastating effectiveness precisely because they knew what they were fighting to protect. Every human military doctrine, every weapon system, every tactical innovation had been created by people who desperately wanted never to use them. But they had also understood that wanting peace wasn't enough. Someone had to be prepared when the unthinkable happened. The galaxy had spent millennia hoping that threats like the Devourers would never appear. Humans had spent their entire civilization preparing for the moment when hope wasn't enough. They had turned themselves into the galaxy's insurance policy against extinction. In the months that followed, a new galactic order emerged, not through conquest or intimidation, but through a quiet understanding that had spread from world to world. Humanity had become the galaxy's unofficial guardians, not because they had seized power, but because they had proven they could be trusted with it. Other species began to sleep easier, knowing that somewhere in the galaxy, the Deathworlders were keeping watch. If existential threats arose again, if some new horror emerged from the dark between stars, humanity would answer the call. The galaxy finally had protectors who protected not for glory or power, but simply because someone had to.